I almost forgot.
I was remembering and then forgot immediately.
Okay, welcome back. I think we got almost everyone back. So let's get started and report out. So hopefully everybody selected one person or one or two people to report out what they talked about in their room. I am a professor, as I said when I introduced myself. So I do this a lot. And I like to allow you all to volunteer. And then if you don't volunteer, then I'm going to call on you. So, who wants to
I'll
volunteer
go first.
first? Okay, go ahead, Carson.
I don't remember what room I was in, but all of the organizations, the people who were in the different organizations, they do try to incorporate the 5 C's in some way. Some less formal, others more formal. But the biggest thing that is incorporated in all of the organizations is compassion and caring, and kind of knowing some of the needs that our young people need. Some of the challenges we had talked about for me was competency, and then also how to establish and use the 5 C's. And we also talked about research and surveys as things that can be challenging because you have to collect so much data. You got to look at so much data. And then I don't remember what question 3 was.
Sorry.
Okay. Things that aren't accounted the things that aren't accounted for are maybe the research and surveys and things like that.
Okay.
And then as far as the last question, yes, we feel like our youth are, yes, we feel like the youth, sorry, let me go get the question. I'm sorry.
It's, do fully engaged young people have power to create change?
So yes, we do believe that they have, they can influence change, but we need to support them more. We can give them all the tools and things like that, but if we don't support them in those things, then they may feel that their voices aren't going to be heard.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to actually, talk a lot about that last one in our presentation. So thank you so much, Carson, for that report out. Is there another room that wants to report out?
I'll go next. I was appointed to be our speaker. I was in room 5, I believe. And so we talked about the 5 C's, and we talked about some that was more challenging for us. And one was connection, and the other one was caring and compassion. And the caring and compassion came from a perspective of Althea, I think her name, Althea, who was in our group. She's a teacher, and she teaches in the Highlands, in the schools in the Highlands, and most of the kids who go there are from the Highlands. And so she says, and Althea, please speak up for you, because I think you'll say it a little better than me. But she says that within her classroom, that it's a little difficult for her kids to kind of take the perspective of the people who aren't from a similar background as they are, so that caring and compassion is kind of doesn't really transfer or kind of connect with other communities. Is that right out there? Thumbs up, thumbs down, you think? Okay.
Yeah, it's not that they lack compassion. It just the word that comes to mind for me is a little bit of like condescension, where it's like they're just being, we're helping, but maybe not seeing the humanity. It's like, let's have a food drive, let's have a coat drive, but not let's build a relationship, like, if that makes sense. So
Thanks for that clarification. And then we talked about do fully engaged young people have power to create change? And we talked about whenever they do, do something good, or when they're contributing to the community, that it's like a photo op. And this is what Nefertia was kind of highlighting, is that, all the news channels want to come, and then you want to get the Courier Journal to come. And then there's a spark, within the youth for that. But then there's not really transformational change that you see, after that. And then with the question, with the PYD model, it's supposed to be strengths-based on other things that are not accounted for. And we talked about that as well. And we came to the conclusion that it doesn't really take into account the backgrounds of everybody that's coming, into the room. So like everybody's coming into the room and everybody's bringing their experiences. Everybody is bringing, their context into the room, but the PYD doesn't really account for everybody's different experiences within one setting.
Yeah, thank you so much, Antonio. I'm loving the fact that, we're engaging in an active critique of these models that are often handed to us as if they are, and we use the language evidence-based all the time, right? So because of the surveys that were mentioned earlier and the data we have to collect for programs to make sure we're meeting outcomes, a lot of times the only way you can get funding is if you do use and employ evidence-based programming. And the 5 C's is one of the strongest model that we have empirical data behind in the field of youth development. And so that's why we're using it today in discussion. But I do want to clarify that when we talk about the 5 C's of positive youth development, they were actually developed specifically for youth, right? And this very, my critique of it is this very paternalistic view that this is what we need. These are the things we need to instill in youth. So I think a lot of you all were kind of discussing it around how you as adults engage in compassion and have competence and the character and all those contributions, but we're thinking about what, how does your program incorporate instilling that character development and the contribution and the caring in young people through your programming? So I'm interested to know if anyone talked about that in their group, if they can report out.
We talked somewhat about it, and I can talk for my group. I was like Antonio. I was also thrust into the speaking role here, and I'll be honest. I didn't take not one note, so I'll just go with what resonated with me organically, if that's fine. I think it was Minerva that mentioned helping instill the value into kids in our programming, which is super important as far as how incorporating the 5 C's would be. In our group in particular, the first and second bullet point kind of went hand in hand about how to incorporate it and what challenging. The first challenge that I heard some of my colleagues mention was experience or lack thereof in the field. And what I would assert to those individuals is to say that until you feel like you have that programming experience, you are the program. So what that means is, how would you exude some of the 5 C's when you come into contact with children, whether it's through a practicum or whether it's through field work, whatever it might be. So I think it's important to exude and model those 5 C's, and therein lies the challenge. If you feel like maybe that's out of your comfort zone, or maybe you don't have the experience you're wanting to have in working with some of the young folks you've chosen to work with. How do you get that experience, but how do you exude what you want to be? And I would say that's super important. One thing, we talked about it a little bit in the strengths based, but looking at it from the school side as well, some things that may not be accounted for is the model might be strengths based, but does it include a deficit analysis? What that might mean is maybe you have a child who has an IEP or 504, and maybe there are deficits there that may not be academic. They could also be other emotional barriers to learning. How or is that accounted for? Certainly could be an issue on my side, whether it's the school side working at Georgia Sheffy Tap or walking into summer works where I don't know what deficits a particular child might have in the site. Maybe he's EBD, and that might affect how I handle conflict resolution with that child. And as far as fully engaged people having the power to create change, I think we all agree that definitely have the power. But one thing I would have liked to gotten to, we didn't quite have enough time, is to analyze not just having the power, but how do I use the power? You can have the internet, you can have Snapchat, you can also have TikTok. And as if anybody has looked at TikTok, there are various ways you can use it. You can argue what's right and what's wrong, but there are ways that you can use it in particular with social justice. So how the power is being used, I think, is eminently important here. And anybody in my group, please piggyback or jump in if I forgot something you said. I apologize. It's my birthday and I'm hanging on.
Happy birthday, Jimmy. Thank you for representing our group.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Jimmy.
Thank you, sir.
No, thank you, Jimmy. You did a great job. Thank you.
Does anyone have anything else to add from that group?
No, I think that was great.
Okay, awesome. Well, just for the sake of time, I'm going to move us on over, but I want to thank you, Jimmy, for what you contributed, because you are really kind of really questioning and beginning to question deficit and how we're looking at deficit-based. And, you know, positive youth development was brought in so we can shift from a deficit view of young people and viewing them as problems, and then how do we focus in on their assets, right? And that was the purpose of positive youth development. We then transitioned to community youth development, and Rebecca was sharing a little bit about how community youth development looks like incorporating young people more into the infrastructure and the way that your program is structured. So you see youth leadership councils pop up and youth boards pop up where organizations give young people a say in how their community works and how their organization works, right? And so what we have, and you can move to the next slide, Rebecca, is we have a transition from community youth development to social justice youth development. And one of the very first articles published in the literature on youth development is published in 2002, right? So we're over like 2 decades now, almost 2 decades now of looking at social justice youth development in the research and in the literature in the field of youth development. But what I will say is that social justice youth development has been happening way before this article is published in 2002, right? And so I want us, when we talk about it today, I want us to think through some examples of how you might have experienced social justice youth development when you were growing up, or how you might have heard history or some stories around, oh, that might have been SJYD, you know? But I will say that in 2008, Sean Ginwright and Camerota coined and named this approach to youth development that really is focused in on, one, critiquing positive youth development and saying that it continues to dismiss the social, economic, and political influences that can homogenize and simplify individual identities. And positive youth development also fails to examine the complex social, economic, and political forces that impact the lives of young people, right? And this is, you know, the authors of this paper argue that, you know, they're really focused in on young people who are at the margins of their communities, but we argue that social justice youth development is impactful and important for all young people. In 2018, my colleagues and I built on that definition of social justice youth development, and the one that you see on the slide is the one that we developed in 2018. And we really pulled it out and really talked about how it is an approach really focused in on equity, so equitable access and opportunities for all young people. And how do we do that? Because at the end of the day, youth development is a practice, right? So we're engaging in forms of action by using a set of principles. So SJYD does have principles, and how we apply those principles is in the way of actively working to reduce or eliminate disparities in all of these systems, right? So there are disparities in our education system. There are disparities in our health system, in our employment and economic system, in our justice system, and all the other systems that might hinder the development of young people, right? And so this was kind of a definition that we wanted to throw out there because we hadn't really updated it. And so Rebecca and I are still having conversations around social justice youth development, but one of the most important things, and you can go to the next slide, you're good. One of the most important things for SJYD and the vision for SJYD is that it offers us guidance not only in our research as a researcher, but also as a practitioner of youth development. So youth workers who are working directly with young people, SJYD gives you a framework to work in programming with young people. And so the common vision for youth is focused in on one that has youth agency involved in it. It has collective action, and it is focused in on organization towards change in the community, right? And that is a different approach than positive youth development, right? Positive youth development is really focused in on the individual young person and how we can change the individual young person. And it fails to acknowledge the fact that there's a problem with the systems that they're navigating. The young people are not the problem. The systems are the problem. And so when we shift that focus, we begin to engage in social justice youth development in a really intentional and critical way. And so some of the things that we really focus in on is, like, for example, youth agency. If we're shifting the focus from the individual young person being the problem to the system being the problem, how are we creating room and space for young people to be agents of social change? How are we creating room for their voices to then shift and change how the systems work, right? Collective action. Young people cannot do it alone because we live in a system that makes it really difficult to do that, right? Because adults have a lot of power and young people do not, right? And the example I always give is, like, you have a school board, right? Young people make up majority of the individuals in an education system, but the school board is made up of mostly adults, right? And so sometimes we do have school boards that will have youth representation on it. And we'll talk about a little bit about youth leadership and how we incorporate young people into it. But we have to think about collective action and how we work alongside young people and we work together to engage in that social change. And so that leads us to that third bullet point here, where we're really focusing on organizing ourselves and organizing alongside young people to create changes in our community. And you can go to the next slide. So here we have, oh, this is your slide, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Go for it.
I thought you were just gonna jump on in. That's okay.
I get tired.
As Dr. Brown was talking about, Jen Wright and Camarota were sort of the first people that were writing about the social justice youth development model. And so we kind of look to their writings when we're looking at basic foundations and principles. So here we have the 4 basic principles related to social justice youth development. And so, and of course my screen got blocked. Young people should be conceptualized in relationship to specific economic, political, and social conditions. So as Dr. Brown was talking about, we have to think about youth not in isolation. They live in neighborhoods. They live in places where there are political decisions that are impacting them, social influences them, and they don't have a voice in terms of impacting those themselves. So we need to think about, when we're working with them, they're not just coming to our program and doing what our program has to offer. They're also living these lives that have all of these different influences that are bearing upon them. And whether that's, just within the education system, within their community, those are all things that have an impact on their well-being. So Principle 1. Principle 2, the youth development process should be conceptualized as a collective response to the social marginalization of young people. And so again, as Dr. Brown was talking about, young people really lack power in our system. And we make all of these decisions, adults make all of these decisions that bear an impact on not just their immediate well-being, so not just where they are when they're 14, but have an impact on where they're going to be when they're 18 or 20 or 25. And they have no say in what those decisions are going to be often. And oftentimes adults don't look to youth to give that input. They're not, they don't look kindly when youth provide their input, and it's not solicited either. So there's this idea of youth knowing their place, children knowing their place. And that's kind of where we really talk about adultism and this idea that adults really think that they know all things for all people, and maybe reconsidering our relationship to knowledge and youth's relationship to knowledge. So principle 3, young people are agents of change, not simple subjects to change. So regardless of whether we want to admit it, youth organizing and youth having this voice, when they do it, they can make change. And so they are agents of change. They do have the power to be able to do this, as long as adults are not kind of oppressing them from doing that. So a lot of times the barrier to youth making these change and to speaking out is the adults who are preventing them from having their voice. And again, principle 4, young people have basic rights. So again, we just kind of think about youth as being people that we facilitate program to, that we educate on, that we give our wisdom to. And so that's not always the case. As adults, we do not always know what's best for youth. Youth have an input, and the situation that we went through whenever we were 14 through 18 or 10 through 24, just because we were that age at one point does not mean that we know what's best for people who are in that age bracket at this particular time, because our experience is never going to be the same. And our social, economic, political systems, situations, they vary from time to time to time. And so we need to be cognizant of that and acknowledge that as we're working with youth. And so as you can see, we have the principles, but then you may be able to see within those arrows, we have critical consciousness, social change, and collective action. And so as we move forward, we're going to talk about kind of the intersection of those different concepts and how they also bear an influence on if we're doing social justice youth development, or if we're simply doing youth development, or if we are just working with youth. So I'll hand it back to Dr. Brown.
All right, thank you for breaking down those principles. So as we talked about when we opened this presentation, Rebecca shared that, like, what is youth development? Youth development is a set of principles, and it is a natural process that's going to happen. Young people are going to develop and transition into adulthood. And it's also a practice, right? And in social justice youth development, the practice of doing social justice youth development involves critical consciousness development. And this is the piece that I think that as I've done presentations, I've been doing a lot of presentations in Louisville around SJYD, I don't really get to dig too deep in critical consciousness development. So we're gonna dig some roots into critical consciousness today, okay? So critical consciousness is a concept that is often used to talk about how we begin to think about our world and how we exist in our world and our relationship to our world. And it's usually used to talk about learning and education, right? And it comes from a South American scholar, Paulo Freire, and he defines critical consciousness as learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of your reality, right? And so, example that I always give is we've had, and currently in this country, we're having a lot of conversations around what is being taught in schools, right? And what is being taught in schools around this term that the media is using that they have no idea what it means. Critical race theory, right, is being used. And so when we think about the education system and we think about what we know now that we did not learn when we were being taught, right? One of the things that I always talk about is I was told that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. And so Abraham Lincoln is like our best president because he freed the slaves, right? And I was not taught the importance of the economic system at the time and how Abraham Lincoln and a lot of other abolitionists were like, hey, so it's economically better if we end slavery. Not because y'all really cared of ending slavery, it was money that was driving this, right? And we have to begin to think critically about the policies and practices in our history to be able to understand how we move forward and change our world to where we are no longer all experiencing inequities, right? And so critical consciousness is that process in social justice youth development that we engage in with young people. And oftentimes youth workers are learning alongside young people in this critical consciousness development. And so we have to think about these three concepts within critical consciousness, okay? It's a formula, is how I like to think about it. There's critical reflection, right? And that's when you start asking why. Why am I here? How did I get here? How did we get here? What's happening, right? You start asking how and where you exist in the world. Why does my community look the way that it does? And when I go to St. Matthew's, it looks totally different. Why is that, right? And we begin to critically reflect, young people begin to critically reflect on why these things are happening. And then you have critical motivation, which is focused in on developing motivations to address the injustices you see, whether those be real injustices or perceived injustices. You begin to get motivated to change them. Like, it's not okay that when I drive to St. Matthew's, the streets look really nice and they have a Whole Foods and a Trader Joe's and a Kroger all within like a 2-mile radius, right? The motivation to change that, right, is the next step in critical consciousness development. And then the third step is when you begin to take action, right? And so we take action through critical action where we work to combat or address the injustices towards social change. And I want to say that it's really important to talk about collective action here. You cannot, like, young people cannot do it by themselves. And a lot of that has to do with power and how power is distributed within our world, right? So these are the three components and three elements that we use in research to assess critical consciousness development for young people. So we actually have surveys and ways to measure a young person's critical consciousness development. So how critically are you thinking about the world around you, and how motivated are you to then engage and think through ways to address those injustices? And then are you actually engaging in the action to make social change, right? And so when we talk about social justice youth development, this piece of it, this element of it of critical consciousness is really at the center of it. And the social action piece becomes really important. SJYD is not just doing social justice lessons with young people, okay? And I'm gonna repeat it. SJYD is not just doing social justice lessons and activities with young people. That critical action piece is key, okay? So we're not just saying, okay, well, we're gonna have someone come in and talk to our young people about redlining, and now they're educated about redlining, and so we did SJYD. No. SJYD is critical. It involves engaging in forms of action. You can move to the next slide, Rebecca. And so this is really key, right? And so there's this concept called praxis when we talk about critical consciousness development. And praxis is this coming together of critically thinking about what's happening in your world and then engaging in forms of social action to create social change. So an example. Wait, hold on. Before I give you the example, let me go through these 3 levels of awareness. I get really excited about SJYD. Y'all know I get real riled up. So let me calm down. So self-awareness is the first level that young people go through, right? And so that's when you notice young people beginning to really engage in their identity development. Like, who am I, right? And so I'm a Black girl, so I'm going to talk about like Black girl things real quick. So my hair, my relationship to my hair, right? And how I grew up in a world, and I'm from Texas, so I grew up in the South in the relationship that I had to my hair, and the way it just naturally grew out of my head wasn't okay for me because I was told that that wasn't beautiful and that wasn't pretty, right? And so when you begin to develop a self-awareness, you begin to appreciate your beauty, and you begin to not subscribe to what society tells you is beautiful. You begin to accept who you are and your identity. So a lot of times, especially in some of my research, I do some research around Black identity development and Black youth identity development. A lot of times there is this experience of internalized racism, right? Where you begin to internalize the negative things that people believe about Black people, right? So you might begin to internalize that people like me aren't very smart. You begin to internalize that people like me aren't very healthy, or people like me aren't able to make a lot of money, right? And that's not true, right? Like, there's some of the smartest people in the world are Black, right? Some of the most beautiful people in the world are Black, right? And so that self level of awareness begins to grow when you're engaging in social justice youth development. Social awareness is the next level, and social awareness is really focused in on how does your social environment, how are you understanding your social environment, right? And that happens a lot of times when you have young people who are living in under impoverished conditions. They begin to think that it's their fault, right? If only, like, my family made more money, if only they made better choices, if only, and that language comes from somewhere, right? Those things are being instilled in young people, and as they engage in programs, as they watch the media and those types of things. And so social awareness is really when you begin to understand that your environment is connected to larger systems, and your environment is connected to people in positions of power who make decisions about what your environment looks like. And that's the social level of awareness, right? So my neighborhood was historically redlined. And so it looks like this because there were policies in place that made it impossible for property values to be some higher, so that way it looks different, right? That's when social awareness begins to grow. And then global level of awareness is my favorite. And that is the one where you begin to identify with the struggles of others, right? Of people who might not share your same identity. And my example of global awareness that I give, and it's so present today now, is when protests were happening in Ferguson after the murder of Mike Brown. And there were certain things that were being used in terms of rubber bullets and pepper spray and all those things that were happening. No one had ever seen that type of military stuff happening on the ground in the streets in the United States. But it was the young people in Palestine that were tweeting young people in Ferguson and telling them to go get milk to treat the wounds that were happening, and their eyes burning and their face burning from what was happening as they were protesting in the streets. And the ability for these groups of young people who live on completely different parts of the world, being able to connect with one another and recognize that we are struggling in the same way that you're struggling, and we're going to connect with one another and support one another, that is the global level of awareness. It's when you begin to identify with the struggles of others. And that is like the work and the goal of social justice youth development. It's really focused in on this collective action piece, which is important. So we have the critical consciousness development here, and then we have the social action, which then leads us over into social change, right? So it is a process. And it looks very linear here, but it's really more of a cyclical process. And you might have to go back and revisit certain pieces of these levels of awareness. So you might get to global awareness, but you might have to go back to social awareness because a young person might not understand a specific part of their social environment. We might have to go back, right? You can move to the next slide.
Can I just jump in for a second and
please
just to clarify, critical consciousness refers most heavily to the identities of youth that are marginalized or oppressed. And so when we're thinking about this critical consciousness formation, it initially was related to race, but now it's expanded into other identities. So if we're talking about gender and sexual diversity, for instance, their identity development, the self-awareness, social awareness, global awareness, and then, intersectionality, of course. So someone does not only have one identity, they have multiple identities. And so as Dr. Brown was saying, you may have to go back to different levels based on that intersectionality and not really understanding a specific component. And so while critical consciousness is not necessarily the term that would be used for instance, white identity development, it's still important that white youth understand kind of this identity component and are able to move through this process in other ways. So I just wanted to jump in and say that before.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you. That is critical and so important. So this next slide is really about social justice youth development policy and social change. So these particular, here you see this model and it's more of a circle, and identity is at the center of it. So we make identity central to work and embrace youth culture. And that's the key, right? That is literally the key that opens the door to social justice youth development. This idea that we don't see color, this idea that we don't see identities, right? Makes it really difficult to engage in SJYD work because the whole point is to alleviate and address inequities and disparities and really look at how we can change our world so that way we are all feeling like we can exist and be well and feel safe and feel secure in our environments, right? And so the process of social justice youth development starts with a power analysis, right? So Rebecca mentioned intersectionality, and I think one of the most important pieces of intersectionality that often gets missed is that it's not just the fact that we all have identities, right? It's the fact that our identities are connected to power, right? And so if you are a white man, you are both white, which puts you in a position of power, and you're a man, which puts you in a position of power because patriarchy, right? And so we have to analyze power. And when we do it with young people, we have to realize, and we've been talking about this, that adultism is real, right? Like we create a world where young people do not have a say in how their day-to-day lives can go. They don't necessarily have a say in a lot of the programs that they are a part of, and they really don't have a say in policies within organizations that they participate in and engage in, right? And so when we analyze power, it becomes really important for youth voice to be a piece of it, right? That's how we begin to open the door for the redistribution of power within our organizations. And so we then transition to encouraging collective action, right? And so we do this by making sure that the space is available and it feels safe for young people to begin to engage in and plan out ways that they want to engage in action to change their world, right? An example I often give that is one of my favorites is the young people who are dreamers, right? And they were brought to this country when they were really, really young. And we're like, y'all are gonna deport us? We've been here our whole life, right? Like, that doesn't make any sense. This is our home, right? And they literally sat in Capitol buildings demanding that an act be passed for them to be able to remain in this country, right? And so this is an example of being able to think critically about, like, this isn't right. That's not my home. Why are they sending us back home when that's not our home? This is our home. And then engaging in collective action. And that was through, you know, the power of adults helping them think through policies and write policies to then advocate for a DREAM Act to be passed. And so we encourage collective action within our programming and within the work that we do. And that's how we promote and are able to create systemic change, okay? And one thing, well, actually, I wanna see if Rebecca wants to add anything before we delve into Heart's Ladder.
No, I think we're good. And just thinking about this both inside your program as well as within the community as a whole. So while this is applied most often to community change, this is also something that should occur within the programmatic context as well. And then there.
So I remember earlier when I think it was Antonio might have been reporting out and we were talking through, or you mentioned this idea about young people having the power to have social, like engage in social change, right? And are they fully prepared to do that? And this is called Roger Hart's Ladder of youth participation. And we use it a lot in youth development. And we use it as our guide to understand, are we authentically engaging in making sure that young people's voices are not only heard, but they're taken seriously, right? And so at the top of the ladder, the rung number 8 is young people's initiative, decisions made in partnership with adults, right? So we talk a lot about, we use the language of youth-led, and we like to say things are youth-led, and that's the goal. We want to make sure that young people are engaging in forms of leadership, but it's really also important for us to be realistic with ourselves, right? And so we never want to be on that bottom rung of manipulation, right? Where we're using young people to support our projects and we're pretending that it's the result of young people's inspiration or young people came up with it. We never want to be doing that. And realistically, we want to be up at the top of the ladder, but unfortunately, we exist under systems that make it really hard, right? And so oftentimes we find ourselves on rung 3, 4, maybe 5, especially 5 where adults make decisions and young people are consulted. So you're like, here are your choices. We can do this or we can do this. And then you're like, okay, it was youth-led. They decided. And it's like, youth have to initiate what happens, right? And so, hold on, yes. So one of the biggest things with Heart's Ladder, and I really like to give this example, and then we'll move on to our discussion. We're running out of time because I talk a lot, but one example of rung 8 on Heart's Ladder and how you can incorporate the social justice lessons you're doing and engage in SJYD and making sure that action is there. So I was participating in a program and they do a lunch with the elders every summer. And so you bring in an elder from the community and that elder comes and talks about their experiences growing up in the community. And also it's generally an organizer, somebody in the community who's done some organizing organizing around a social issue to come and talk about those things, right? So the young people are sitting down listening to this elder talk about their experiences, and eventually they get into a conversation around how, you know, she lives on this street, but she's having to leave her house really soon and sell her house because she can't afford the property taxes because her neighborhood is being gentrified, right? And she just randomly says it randomly on the side. That wasn't the purpose of the conversation, but the young people start to think critically and they're like, that's not okay that she's being pushed out of her house. And they go to the adults, the caring adults in their program, and they're like, we want to do something about it. And so we've decided that we want to go door to door and we want to knock on the doors of everybody in the neighborhood and let them know what's happening to the elder that came and spoke. And we want to raise money to be able to make sure that she can cover her property taxes and so she doesn't lose her home. But in addition to that, we also want this zoning stuff to change. And so we're going to go to city council and we're going to tell, like, we want to do a presentation in front of them and tell them this isn't okay. And so young people took the initiative and they went to the adults for support. Do you all see the differences between we're organizing this event as adults and we invited young people to participate versus we created a space where they start to think critically about something and now they're engaging in action that they planned and created? That's the difference between being on the lower levels of the rung of Roger Hart's ladder and being up at the top. And so that becomes really important. But I want to say this quick caveat that this ladder is just a starting point. And Roger Hart, who created it, even says, like, this is not the end all be all. Please don't use it as that. It is a starting point for us to engage in discussion and conversation. So what's really important is that we get the idea that we want to make sure that youth leadership is integrated in a part of our social justice youth development practice, right? And so think about this ladder as you're thinking about how are young people going to be leaders within my organization and within my program, and how do I create the space for that youth-led and youth leadership to happen? Next slide, I think, is a breakout. Yes. So we are going to do a breakout and I'm going to give you all not 20 minutes that I plan. We'll probably get maybe 7 minutes is what we'll do. So we really want you all to think through, where are you in terms of this ladder, youth participation on the ladder, and then how can you move towards more authentic youth voice and youth-led programming? And what are barriers you experience to get higher up on the ladder within your program?
And I went ahead and put it in the chat box so that they could have it there.
And I am setting up breakout rooms right now. Y'all are going to probably be in your same breakout rooms that you were in before. I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms for you all to go, and you should have those questions in the chat.
Hey, can you throw me back into a breakout room? I need to take a picture.
Sure
right quick.
can.
Thank you.
If I can find it, because technology is hard. Here we go. Okay, I think I've put everybody in a room, but there's still people out here that haven't joined their room.
I may have stepped away.
Yeah.
Did you want to pause the recording, Felicia, since we're in a breakout?
Figuring out how to, as people come and we have regulars, to be able to put it in their court to be like, okay, let's talk about things that you would like to learn about or things that you would like to know, and then just be a supporting person there so they can lead the discussion once we actually have them there, but kind of still in the planning phases of that. So definitely going to be a barrier for us to figure out how to get them to be engaged and actively coming up with kind of the topics that they want to know about. And then we had talked a little bit about as far as like getting kids to have their own agency and independence to talk, the struggle being that, like, say, for example, for employment or jobs, that if they, come to us looking for help with a job, it's all about, baseline things. So getting a job and making money right now so that they can support, but trying to talk to them about career development and things along those lines, and like having them come up with their own identity with that has definitely been difficult because that's not the first thing on their mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Lane, for sharing that. Do you have any other folks that want to share what they discussed in their room? I'm interested to know if it's similar.
Could we have someone from one of the groups that hasn't shared already for either?
Uh-oh, I told you I'm a professor. Who can I call on? That's random. That haven't heard from.
I can share.
Okay.
I
Oh,
was,
hey, Nefertiti.
hey, I was in group 5, and I shared that I only work with youth build during the summertime. So to be honest, I don't know how much how much true input that young people have in like decision making. I know for sure that they are at least at a level 3. I would like to say that they're at a level 4 or 5, but how can I verify that? Because a lot of the undergoings of the planning and stuff that happens throughout the year, I do not see. And then the question is, should it be more apparent to me? If it was truly happening, would it be like a everybody knows what's going on type of thing? Who's to say? Someone else in our group shared that she sort of leads a community service, I guess, club in her school, and that she tries to implement and tries to get input from the kiddos who she serves on a weekly or bi-weekly basis whenever they meet. But sometimes it's more like, what field trips might you want to go on? Let's come up with ideas, so on and so forth. And if you want to chime in and say the rest of what you say, you are more than welcome.
Sure thing. What I was saying too about that community service group is that we've had some really great projects that were probably like 7 or 8. They were truly like youth-led initiatives. But what I'm guilty of is like we had this like great successful thing, and I just made it an annual tradition rather than like check back in, and or let them do that every year. And part of the struggle is you just get group dynamic where you have some kids that are just more groups, not just individuals, where they're just more passive and they just want you to tell them, like, you can do this thing, here are some service project ideas kind of thing. And they want you to implement the program for you, Then you have others that I've just, might have different ideas that I'm realizing that I've probably failed to check in with in a significant way. Because I'm always like, is there something that you want to do? But then rather than pause and let them tell me, I'm kind of like, because these are the things that we've done in the past, and like, just kind of rethinking that for the upcoming school year.
Awesome. That's good to hear. Yeah, let's talk through that. Let's talk through some of that. Transition to the next slide, Rebecca, if you can. So we figured you all would share and discuss in your rooms some possible answers to these questions. And so some of them were, especially in terms of the barriers. So we're really talking about what are the barriers to getting to these higher rungs of the ladder. It's more work to do that is some things we hear oftentimes, that there's no time built in to allow opportunities for this to happen. Funding is a huge thing. There's a lot of funding requirements. And so you may be getting funding to do a specific project or a specific thing with the young people. And the funder's giving you parameters around how that's being done. For example, homework help and how that happens. And then you might be funded just to do homework help. So that doesn't allow you or give you the opportunity to say, oh, hey, there's this action happening in the community that we have to go to. And then we don't have organizational support. The organization is not supportive of us going to these higher rungs of the ladder. We can't trust young people to come up with things. We can't trust them to create their own initiative and have initiative to do that. And then young people aren't interested. And that's one that I think I heard both people report out, is that young people are just going to go along with what you tell them and they're looking to you for direction. And I think that one is really important. And I think that one is like one of the most popular ones that I've heard. And I think a lot of that has to do with, we have to think about our systems, right? So the education system is structured in a way to where we are handing young people, this is how this is done. Here's your schedule. This is where you need to be at this time during this day. And you need to be here. If you're not here, you're in trouble. And this is your homework. And this is how you do it. Here's the exact way you calculate this equation. If you do it this way, then you're going to get the answer wrong. I'm not going to give you credit for it. Like, we literally instill in them to sit there and let us dictate how they think about the world. And so it becomes really hard for them to transition to, oh, so we get to decide? I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, right? And so sometimes young people can be uncomfortable when you give them the opportunity, or whenever you're creating spaces to get to those higher rungs of the ladder. But you have to keep pushing, and you have to make sure that you have that connection and that trust, and you're building that connection and that trust in order to get to those higher rungs of the ladder. And you can transition to the next slide. So whenever young people aren't given these opportunities, we're sending them messages, right? So it's messages that I don't trust you, messages that you don't have power, the message that adults know better than you, and we know what's best for you, and your opinion doesn't matter. Right? And so if they've internalized all of these things, then you're going to see that last bullet point on the last slide, where it's like young people aren't interested because they already know how this is going to go. Right? And so how do we make sure they're not receiving those messages? Thank you for moving me along, because we only have 15 minutes left. So we did a study, and I'm going to go through this really quickly, but we did a study and we presented it to BLOCS, actually. So some of you all might have been here when we showed you all our results, but we talked to youth development workers here in Louisville, and they really highlighted their perceptions of behavior and perceptions of behavioral health as primary challenges in doing their jobs, right? So we are really trying to better understand the connection between the race of young people and the race of youth worker, and how those behaviors that they see and may deem as negative have a lot to do with racial mismatch between the two. So we're really thinking about what youth workers think is normal behavior and what they think is good behavior is probably most likely rooted in what they were taught was normal and good behavior, right? And so how do we define good and acceptable behaviors? Where do we get those definitions from? How do we recognize when we are pushing youth towards conformity? And when we push young people to conform to the status quo, we think we're doing a good job. We think we're instilling good things in them. We're thinking we're doing the 5 C's of positive youth development. But this is where Rebecca and I have this beef with the 5 C's of positive youth development, because How are you defining what compassion looks like? How are you defining what it means to have good character, right? And are you talking about good character from the perspective of what, white society has deemed normal? Right? We all come from different perspectives. We all come from different cultures. And so we really have to analyze as youth workers, if you're engaging in social justice youth development, what is the status quo? And are you pushing young people to be a part of the status quo, or are you pushing them to change the world in a way to where everybody is experiencing equity? Right? And though that's really critical, and that's what's coming out of our findings from our study, is that we're realizing that youth development workers are seeing that what they view as good and acceptable really impacts their relationship with those young people and their ability to build relationships with those young people. And then that impacts their ability to do SJYD altogether. Anything you want to add, Rebecca?
Sorry, I've pushed you ahead.
No, you're good. We have like 10 minutes and I ramble.
Yeah, no, I think that that's kind of right on. We just need to think about how we are promoting those stereotypical white middle class Eurocentric values in the programming that we're doing with youth. And so really recognizing within ourselves and analyzing within ourselves, how have I been socialized to believe that this is correct, that this is the way things go, that this is what respect looks like. You need to look me in the eyes. You need to do these things, because those really vary depending on the community and the culture that someone comes from. So, it's not just when you're working with the international community that those become barriers to you creating connections with youth. It's also when you're working with all youth. So just really thinking about that and reflecting. And I think we don't do enough of that as youth workers, thinking about, where did I get the idea that this was correct? And really challenging yourself to consider whether maybe it's not correct.
So really quickly, I'm going to tell you all that we have an updated definition of social justice youth development, because it's constantly changing and we're constantly learning more. And not only that, things are constantly happening in our world. And with that, we want to adjust how we do and practice SJYD. And so we're defining it as an approach to youth development focused on the adoption of practices by individuals, organizations, communities, and systems, seeking to close gaps created by inequities in access and opportunities for youth. And we do this by means of, the first thing is we need to acknowledge and celebrate differences in identities and experiences of youth, right? So think back to what we just said in terms of what is the norm, and what is the norm, and how did I learn this norm? The second thing is working towards youth identified, created, and led initiatives. So think back to that ladder we were just talking about, and where we are on that ladder within our program. The third thing is acknowledging the role of systemic oppression and intentionally and actively working to reduce and eliminate the disparities for all youth, right? And so in order to deal with systemic oppression, we have to look at the root causes of why why things are the way they are. And Rebecca's gonna talk about that in just a little bit when we bring trauma-informed care and SJYD together. And the fourth thing is implementing methods that promote radical healing for impacted youth. So if we know that young people are traumatized through our work in trauma-informed care by, because of ACEs and because of just living under poverty, we know that those things happen. We have to engage in what's called radical healing, which is another training for another day, but it is the active process of working with young people to make sure that there are opportunities for them to heal from the trauma that they're experiencing. And I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca.
And I just want to throw in there, when we're talking about acknowledging and celebrating differences in identities, a big thing that comes up, and we've been talking a lot about race because race is important, but there are other identities that we often look over, such as when someone has a disability, we engage in this process that's similar to color blindness. I don't see your disability. You're not in a wheelchair, even though it's clear the person is in a wheelchair and they're engaging in program. We choose to ignore it, and by ignoring it, thinking that we're being inclusive. And so just really challenging yourself to push past your own walls of comfortability and discomfort to really be able to embrace that there are differences between youth and differences between people. And those are not just okay, those are great and things that should not be overlooked, because that's what really brings richness to program and to what we're doing. So just wanted to throw that out there as another connection, because I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of inclusiveness with disabilities within the youth development sector. So I'm going to move on to trauma-informed care, and we only have a couple of minutes left. So if you have more questions later about these connections, you can feel free to reach out to me and we can kind of banter back and forth. But there is this question of whether, is trauma-informed care a part of social justice youth development? Are they congruent with one another? Are they compatible with one another? And so I know some of you may have attended the training earlier today around trauma-informed care, which I'm sure was wonderful because it was facilitated by Carol Frame and Joe Cruz. And I know they went through, the trauma-informed care stuff a little bit more in depth. So we're not going to go into it in depth, but if you weren't there, then just having a brief definition of trauma is an experience that threatens an individual's life or sense of safety. And so there are longer definitions. If you go to, SAMHSA, you can get kind of the official definition. But when we think about trauma-informed care, we're thinking about an approach that acknowledges that traumatic experiences are widespread. And so within our organizations and our systems, we're going to choose to try to seek environments that promote healing and recovery rather than allowing ourselves to create systems that continue to traumatize and then re-traumatize from past experiences. So that's just a brief, definition, high level of what trauma-informed care is and trauma. And we bring that up because, as we mentioned with Jen Wright and Camarota, Sean Jen Wright recently, within the last couple of years, wrote an opinion piece where he was kind of detailing his criticisms of trauma-informed care. And so to really wrap it up, he was saying that trauma-informed care doesn't go deep enough and that it doesn't account for the role of systems. So when we think about trauma-informed care, a lot of times we get really focused on the trauma-sensitive interventions. And so like, what are we going to do within this clinical capacity? Or what are we going to do within this individual interaction with youth or with other people? But trauma-informed care is really best suited at the organizational and systems level. So one person acting in a manner that's trauma-informed is not going to create an environment that is trauma-informed. And so just realizing that we kind of push back on what Jen Wright has said and say, trauma-informed care is best used as a framework. And so it can be adopted by organizations and it can be adopted by systems, and it works best whenever it's done that way. And so if you're doing true trauma-informed care, you are taking into account things like race and identity and the traumas that systems impart on individuals because of their identities. And so I would say, like, you're not really doing trauma-informed care if you're ignoring those identity traumas that people experience. And so so trauma-informed care and social justice youth development are linked because you have to account for the oppression in the community within trauma-informed care. And so if you're doing that and you're seeking to kind of move into the social justice youth development framework, that you really are able to do both. So we just wanted to acknowledge that component. And I think another big piece is when we're talking about this transactional approaches versus transformational approaches. So the transactional approaches are when we are looking to transact with institutions to get a short-term gain. So if we think about youth whenever they're experiencing barriers, so for instance, there's not I don't have transportation and there's not, you know, a good way for me to get to program. And so we give them bus vouchers to get to program. So they're able to come, but that doesn't change the fact that there's not adequate transportation for them to get to where they're trying to go. So even after they take the bus, maybe they have to walk like an additional 4 blocks through a neighborhood where violence is kind of prevalent, or where, you know, the sidewalks are not great and there's no lighting. And so at the end of the day, we're engaging in transactional approaches. And so, another approach would be to do transformational work. And so then we're really looking to alter the systems and alter the barriers that are existing within systems. And so rather than giving bus vouchers, we're advocating for, you know, TARC to expand the transit routes. And so we're looking for there to be more stops within the transportation system. Or Dr. Brown has an example that I'll share briefly, where there were some youth who couldn't get to the community center because there was a traffic that was really bad on this road. And so there wasn't a stop where they could just like walk across. There was no stoplight. And so it was dangerous for them to get to program. And so that wasn't something that the adults, it wasn't on their radar because they weren't walking to program and they weren't having to traverse that traffic barrier. And so whenever youth identified that as a barrier, they were able to go to city council, advocate for there to be a stop sign and a crosswalk. And so then they really engaged in transformational work rather than just like an issue-based component that we often engage in. And so, you know, to bring it back, you know, we often talk about like, you know, racism, incarceration, food instability, abuse, when we're talking about traumas and things that people experience. And yes, like I am not advocating that we remove the Band-Aids that we have in place to help people survive while we're trying to do the work. But we just need to recognize that those are Band-Aids. And at the end of the day, those traumas will continue to exist and continue to persist within new populations, new children as they age into adulthood. They're still going to be experiencing all of these things unless we really do work that's aimed at the systems. And at the very root, you see white supremacy is at the very foundation of that trauma tree, because a lot of traumas in our society are rooted in that white supremacist ideology. And so patriarchy and that cishet hegemony, they're also a part of the white supremacy as we see it, but we just pull it out so you can kind of see like this paternalistic system that we have set up is the barrier at the end of the day. And so we really need to be looking at how do we change this system. And with 2 minutes left, we have some space for questions if there are some. I'm willing to stick around. I'm not sure if Dr. Brown has time, but we realized that this was supposed to end at 3. And so, but if there are questions, we'll feel free to ask.
I got a question. So after all of this, you know, everything, all the discussions and everything that you all have talked about and this education that we just received, what can organizations do? Like, what's the next step?
Do you want to take that, Asha?
I sure can. And so I think one of the biggest things, and I wanted to actually share this, is that like we have to think about power. And as individual youth workers, you know, we are within a system, right? Within a system that we may not necessarily have power over. And so we internally have to do some organizing for ourselves in terms of what does it look like for us to advocate for systems change, right? And so who are the leaders of our organizations? Who are the entities within the city that make key decisions around how we connect and engage with young people? And so advocacy work around that, and we need to continue to have conversations. And I think the other piece of this is how do we help youth understand that that's what's happening, right? Because there's a difference between a youth worker going to their boss and their supervisor saying, this isn't okay that this is happening, and young people articulating also that this isn't okay and this is happening. And so when I think about tangible things in terms of how do we address this idea that like there are these systems that are making it really hard for young people to exist in a safe and healthy way, and then that also then makes it really difficult for us as youth workers to do this work, we have to take it higher up to the organization and do advocacy work around that. And we have to take it higher up to the policy level. So what policies exist in the city that make it hard for us to do that? What policies exist in the state, right? And one example is like a young person has to be 18 to sit on a board of directors in the city. Why? I mean, in the state, why is that? Can we change that? Right? Like, I just think about these things that, you know, we can begin to advocate for to create more of that.
And to piggyback, you know, I think if people have been around for the rollout of trauma-informed care, like you see like how education within the community has really caused organizations at the organizational level to really be more intentional about how do we implement this. And so I think we really need to ride the wave of awareness that seems to be happening right now in terms of social justice, in terms of equity, and really use this as a time to push this agenda forward. Because like Dr. Brown was saying, youth workers are underpaid, they're not valued, they're looked at as babysitters. And so I think there's a component of professionalization that there needs to be some organization in terms of, no, youth work is real work. And that's why we often have positions that are not filled, because we don't pay well for youth work, and it is difficult work. So I think that that's a component as well.
I think that's key, is like, we really have to professionalize youth work. And in the same way that teachers have unions and have resources in this way and ways to engage, and social workers do too, what does it look like for youth workers to have something similar? And we're slowly trying to build y'all with the certificate. So we're working on it, and we'd love to have folks at the table for that.
Can I say, I'm sorry, Rebecca.
No, go ahead.
This was excellent, Rebecca and Dr. Asha. This is excellent. Can I also say that I think it'll add a lot of value to have a partnership even here with the young person to just help you all to express the ideas and how important it is to have this level of youth engagement. And I think there's just a lot of power right there, shared power right there. And we can continue to talk about community growth and building relationships while we're exemplifying it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that suggestion. I love it. I love that. Thank you for making sure that youth voice is here at the table.
All right, is that the conclusion, Dr. Brown and Rebecca?
If there are no more questions.
Awesome. All right, you all, it is a smidgen, about a minute after 3. We appreciate you being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I know some of you all have been on here for both sessions, and so I know you can use a break from Zoom, but I just wanted to thank you again. You all are going to receive a survey, so I really do hope that you fill it out. Let us know your thoughts and what you think. We will do this all again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for our next session of the BLOCS Summer Institute. Let me know if you have any questions for me or if I can be of further service. Otherwise, I will see you all tomorrow morning. Thank you all so much. And Dr. Brown has put her email address in the chat, so please notate that. And I appreciate you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Rebecca Bloomer. Thank you. This was such a great session. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. For the link for tomorrow, I sent everybody a meeting request. So the link for tomorrow, Thursday and Friday are going to be the same link. check your meeting request, click on the link, and you'll be able to join first thing in the morning. And Rebecca put hers in as well. So I am excited, you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, and see you tomorrow.
Felicia, can we steal your chat room?
Absolutely, save it. Go ahead and save it.
Because I think Matthew, I don't know if you have availability, Asha, but Matthew was wanting to I think he had some questions he wanted to.
Yeah. So I am going to, anybody who wants to stay on, please feel empowered. I've got to jump to a meeting, but you all have the room now. See you soon.
Great. Thanks,
All right.
Felicia.
Thank you.